July 15, 2024. Mojave Desert. 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
A mother watches her husband drive away, abandoning her and their 3 children with no water, no phone, and no hope of rescue.
Where are you watching from today? Drop your location below. And if you want to see what happens when a victim refuses to stay a victim, when a mother's protective fury becomes unstoppable, then subscribe now, because this story will show you that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the desert, isn't the heat, it's a woman who was left to die and decided to fight back instead. Prepare yourself, this one's intense. The Mojave Desert in July is one of the harshest environments on Earth.
Temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit 46 degrees Celsius, the sun beats down with merciless intensity, and dehydration can kill within hours. It's a place where even experienced hikers die if they're unprepared. And it's where Robert Sullivan decided to abandon his family on July 15, 2024. Robert, 38, had been married to his wife Claire for 12 years. They had 3 children, Emma, 10, Noah, 7, and little Sophie, just 4 years old. To the outside world, they seemed like a normal middle-class family from Riverside, California. Robert worked in sales, Claire was a stay-at-home mom, the kids went to good schools.
But behind closed doors, Robert had been drowning.
The family finances were a disaster: credit card debt over $80,000, a mortgage they could barely afford, car payments they were behind on.
His sales commissions had dried up as the economy shifted.
Claire didn't know how bad it had gotten because Robert had been hiding it, taking out secret loans, gambling online, trying to win enough to catch up, only digging the hole deeper.
2 weeks before the abandonment, Robert had received a final notice from the bank: foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. Creditors were calling constantly.
One of his secret loans was from dangerous people who'd made it clear what would happen if he didn't pay. Robert had felt the walls closing in, suffocating him. And then he'd had a thought, a terrible, cowardly thought that grew from a desperate whisper into a roar he couldn't silence. What if he just left? What if he disappeared and started over somewhere else? Changed his name, got a new identity, left all this debt and responsibility behind. But there was a problem: Claire and the kids. If he just vanished, there would be a missing person investigation. Police would look for him. His creditors would look for him. He'd never truly be free. Unless something happened to them. Unless there was an accident. A tragedy. Something that would explain why Robert Sullivan had disappeared, 2 presumed dead, lost in the same accident that took his family. The insurance policies he had on Claire and the kids would even pay out to his parents, solving part of the financial disaster he'd created. The plan formed slowly over those 2 weeks, each day making it seem more reasonable, more necessary, more like his only option. He'd take the family on a day trip to the desert. They'd done it before. The kids liked seeing the desert landscape, playing in the sand like it was a beach. But this time, he'd drive them deep into the Mojave, far from main roads. And then he'd leave them there. In the July heat. Miles from help. With minimal water. They'd die of heatstroke and dehydration within a day, maybe 2. It would look like they'd gotten lost on a hike. And Robert? Robert would disappear, creating the narrative that he'd gone for help but had also gotten lost and died. His body would never be found because he'd actually be starting a new life in Mexico, where he'd already been slowly moving money into an untraceable account. It was murder. Premeditated, calculated murder of his wife and 3 young children. But Robert had convinced himself it was survival. That he had no choice. That sometimes people had to do terrible things to escape impossible situations. On the morning of July 15th, Robert acted cheerful as he loaded the family into their SUV. Adventure Day, he'd announced. We're going to explore the desert, have a picnic, make it a real expedition. Claire had been happy. Robert had been so stressed lately, so distant. A family day felt like a return to normal. The kids were excited, chattering about desert animals they might see, cacti they could photograph. They drove for 2 hours into the Mojave, leaving the interstate, then the highway, then even the smaller roads, following dirt tracks that led deeper and deeper into the vast, empty desert. Are you sure you know where you're going? Claire finally asked, looking at the endless expanse of sand, rock, and scrub brush around them. No buildings.
No other cars. No signs of civilization at all. "I've got GPS," Robert lied. He'd actually turned off his phone's location services hours ago. "There's a really cool rock formation out here. The kids will love it." But there was no rock formation. There was nothing but heat and emptiness and death waiting for anyone unprepared. Robert finally stopped the SUV in the middle of nowhere, literally nowhere, no landmarks, no trails, nothing but desert in every direction. "Let's explore a bit," he said with forced enthusiasm. "Claire, why don't you take the kids to check out those rocks over there?" He pointed to a formation about half a mile away. "I'll set up the picnic." Claire looked at the rocks, then at Robert. Something felt wrong. Her instincts were screaming at her, though she couldn't articulate why. "Robert, it's so hot. Maybe we should just picnic here by the car where there's shade? Come on, it'll be an adventure. The kids need to burn off energy. Just a quick walk, then we'll eat. I promise." Against her better judgment, and this would haunt her, Claire agreed. She gathered the kids, made sure they each had a water bottle, and started walking toward the rocks. She looked back once and saw Robert watching them, his expression unreadable. She waved. He didn't wave back. They'd walked maybe 10 minutes when Emma said, "Mom, I hear the car." Claire turned around and her heart dropped. The SUV, their SUV, with all their supplies, with her phone she'd left in the cup holder, with everything, was moving. Driving away. "Robert!" Claire screamed, starting to run back toward where the car had been, but it was already too far, moving fast, kicking up dust. "Robert! Wait! Come back!" But the car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. Within minutes, it had disappeared over a ridge, and the sound of the engine faded into the terrible silence of the desert. Claire stood frozen, her 3 children clustering around her, all of them staring at the empty space where their car and husband/father had been. "Mommy?" Sophie asked in a small voice. "Why did Daddy leave?" And Claire, her mind struggling to process what had just happened, what it meant, could only whisper, "I don't know, baby. I don't know." But she did know. Somewhere deep down, she knew. Robert hadn't accidentally driven off. He hadn't gone to get help or find a better spot. He had deliberately abandoned them. In the middle of the Mojave Desert. In 115-degree heat. Miles from anywhere. With only the water in their 3 small bottles and whatever was in Claire's small day pack. He had left them here to die. And as that realization sank in, as Claire looked at her 3 children trusting her to save them, as she felt the merciless sun beating down and understood the magnitude of their situation, she made a decision: they were not going to die. Not today. Not ever. Robert had underestimated her. He'd thought she was weak, dependent, incapable. But he was about to learn something about the woman he'd married. Claire Sullivan was a survivor. And more than that, she was a mother. And a mother protecting her children is the most dangerous force in nature. Robert Sullivan had made the worst mistake of his life. Not in abandoning his family, though that was monstrous. His worst mistake was thinking they wouldn't survive. That Claire wouldn't find a way. That his children wouldn't prove stronger than he'd ever given them credit for. The desert was harsh. But it was nothing compared to what Robert had just unleashed, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. And when they survived, because Claire was going to make sure they survived, Robert would face consequences he'd never imagined. Because the reaction of his abandoned family wouldn't be tears and helplessness. It would be something far more powerful. Something that would shock everyone who heard the story. Rage. Determination. And an absolutely merciless pursuit of justice. But first, they had to survive. And as Claire looked at her 3 children, as she took inventory of their meager supplies, as she began to think through their options with a clarity born of pure adrenaline and maternal fury, the survival began. Not with waiting. Not with hoping. But with action. Because Claire Sullivan might have been abandoned by her husband. But she was about to show him and the world exactly what she was capable of when pushed to the absolute edge. The first thing Claire did, once the shock wore off and she gave herself exactly 60 seconds for shock, because they didn't have time for more, was assess their situation with brutal honesty. They were in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Temperature, approximately 115 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Time, around 11 a.m., meaning they had 6 more hours of peak heat before it would start to cool. Water, 3 small bottles, maybe 24 ounces total. Food, some snacks in her day pack: granola bars, apple slices, crackers. Clothing, summer clothes, not desert appropriate. Sun protection, minimal. Shelter, none. Distance to help, unknown, but certainly many miles in any direction. Their chances, objectively speaking, were not good. Most people who died in the desert died within 24 hours of getting lost, from heatstroke and dehydration. Children died even faster. But Claire had one advantage Robert hadn't counted on: she was an emergency room nurse. Or had been, before the kids were born. She'd seen heatstroke victims. She'd treated dehydration. She knew exactly what would kill them and what might save them. And more than that, she knew something Robert clearly didn't: she was absolutely not going to let her children die because their father was a coward. "Okay, guys," Claire said, keeping her voice calm despite the fury and terror warring inside her. "We're going to treat this like an adventure, okay? A survival challenge. Like on those TV shows." Emma, 10 and perceptive, wasn't buying it. "Mom, Dad left us on purpose, didn't he?" Claire met her daughter's eyes. Emma deserved honesty. "Yes, sweetheart. He did. And I don't understand why. But it doesn't matter right now. What matters is that we're going to get through this together. All 4 of us. I promise you." "How?" Emma asked, and there were tears in her eyes, but also something else: a hardness, a determination that Claire recognized because she felt it too. "By being smart and staying calm," Claire said. "First rule of survival: don't panic. Second rule: conserve energy and water. Third rule: seek shelter from the heat. Fourth rule: make yourself visible for rescue. So that's what we're going to do." She looked around, assessing the landscape with new eyes. The rock formation they'd been walking toward was about another quarter-mile away, closer now to go forward than to go back to where the car had been. And rocks meant potential shade. "We're going to those rocks," Claire decided. "We'll find shade, we'll rest during the hottest part of the day, and we'll make a plan. Walk slowly, don't talk too much. Conserving water means conserving moisture, and we lose moisture when we breathe hard or talk a lot. Emma, you help Sophie. Noah, you stay with me. Let's go." They walked slowly, deliberately, Claire setting a pace that wouldn't overheat the kids. Every few minutes, she'd let them each take a tiny sip of water, not enough to satisfy thirst, just enough to keep their mouths moist. When they reached the rocks, Claire searched until she found what she was looking for: a small cave-like overhang that provided shade and would shield them from the direct sun. It wasn't much, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet high, but it was enough. "This is our shelter," she announced. "We're going to stay here during the hottest part of the day. Everyone sit down, rest, and don't move unless you have to." While the kids settled in the shade, Claire took inventory of everything they had: 3 water bottles, 24 ounces total. In this heat, each of them needed at least a gallon a day to survive. They had maybe enough for one person for a few hours. Her day pack contained 6 granola bars, a small bag of crackers, 2 apples, now warm, a small first aid kit, sunscreen, her car keys, useless, a hair tie, a pen, and a small notebook. Emma had a small backpack with a book, colored pencils, a stuffed animal, and a packet of fruit snacks. The boys had nothing, their things had been in the car. Claire thought through their options. Option 1, stay here and wait for rescue. But who would rescue them? Robert wouldn't call for help, he wanted them to die. No one knew they were out here. They could die waiting. Option 2, try to walk out. But in which direction? They could walk for days and never find help, dying of dehydration in the process. Option 3, create signals that might be spotted by planes or helicopters. Possible, but the desert was vast and air traffic might be minimal. Option 4, some combination of all three: create signals, ration water carefully, and at night when it was cooler, try to walk toward what might be civilization. None of the options were good. But Claire had to choose. Okay, here's what we're going to do, she told the kids. We're going to stay in this shade until evening. We're going to drink water very slowly, just tiny sips when we absolutely need it. We're going to save our energy. And when the sun starts to set and it gets cooler, we're going to walk. Not randomly, we're going to walk in the direction the sun sets, toward the west, because that's where the roads were. How far is it? Noah asked. I don't know, buddy. But we're going to walk as far as we can before it gets too hot again tomorrow. And we're going to keep doing that until we find help or help finds us. Emma was looking at her mother with an expression Claire had never seen before. It was respect mixed with fear mixed with something harder. Mom, are we going to die? Claire could have lied. Could have given false promises. But she looked at her daughter, her brave, smart, perceptive daughter, and gave her the truth. Not if I can help it. And Emma, I'm going to help it with everything I have. Your father might have given up on us, but I never will. Never. Do you understand? Emma nodded, and then she said something that would stay with Claire forever. Good. Because I'm going to survive this so I can tell everyone what Dad did. So he can't get away with it. And there it was, the reaction Robert Sullivan never anticipated. Not helpless victims who would die quietly in the desert, but survivors who would become witnesses. Who would expose him? Who would make sure the world knew exactly what kind of man would abandon his wife and 3 small children to die of heatstroke? Yes, sweetheart, Claire said, pulling Emma into a hug. We're all going to survive this. And we're all going to tell everyone what he did. I promise you that. As the day dragged on and the temperature climbed even higher, Claire focused on keeping the kids calm, cool, and hydrated enough to survive. She had them remove their shoes to let their feet cool. She used the sunscreen to prevent burns. She told stories to distract them from the heat and thirst. And she used the pen and notebook from her pack to write something, a record of what Robert had done, with date, time, location as best she could estimate, everything. Because if they didn't survive, if rescuers eventually found their bodies, at least there would be evidence. Robert wouldn't get away with it even in death. But they were going to survive. They had to. Because Claire had discovered something in that desert that Robert had killed in himself years ago, the absolute, unbreakable determination to protect what mattered most. Robert had chosen to save himself by sacrificing his family. Claire was going to save her family by becoming what she needed to be, harder than the desert, more relentless than the sun, more determined than death itself. By 6 p.m., when the worst heat finally began to fade, Claire gathered her children. It's time to walk, she said. We're going to walk until we can't anymore. And then we're going to rest. And then we're going to walk again. And we're going to keep doing that until we find help. Are you ready? 3 small voices, scared but trusting. Yes, Mom. Then let's go. And remember, we're not victims. We're survivors. And survivors don't quit. They walked into the cooling desert evening, for small figures against the vast emptiness, with nothing but determination and fury keeping them going. Robert Sullivan thought he'd condemned them to death. But he'd actually created something far more dangerous, witnesses who would survive. And they would make sure he paid for what he'd done. They walked through the night, Claire pushing them forward whenever anyone wanted to stop, rationing their water down to the smallest sips, following the stars toward what she hoped was West and civilization. Sophie, only 4, couldn't walk the whole way. Claire carried her when she got too tired, the small girl's weight on her back a physical reminder of what she was fighting for. By dawn of the second day, they'd made maybe 5 or 6 miles. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. And their water was gone. The morning sun rose like a hammer, and Claire knew they were in serious trouble. The kids were showing signs of dehydration, dry lips, dizziness, exhaustion. Sophie was barely conscious. Emma was stumbling. Noah kept saying he was cold even though it was already over 100 degrees, a bad sign. We need to find shade again, Claire decided. We'll rest through the day and walk again tonight. But the landscape had changed, fewer rocks, more open desert. No convenient shade. Claire used the only option she had, she dug. Using her hands and a flat rock, she dug into the sand at the base of a small sand dune, creating a shallow trench. It wasn't much, but sand insulates, it would be cooler below the surface than above it. She had the kids lie in the trench and covered them partially with sand, leaving their faces exposed. Then she used her own body to shield them from the direct sun, lying across the top of the trench, accepting the full heat of the sun on herself to keep them cooler. It was agony. The sun burned her exposed skin. She could feel herself dehydrating, her body overheating. But she didn't move. Hours passed. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness, always jolting awake when she started to slide off her position, always repositioning to keep the kids shaded. At some point, she thought she heard Emma talking, "Mom, wake up. You have to wake up. Don't leave us like Dad did." The words cut through the haze. Claire forced her eyes open. "I'm awake, baby. I'm here. I'm not leaving. You promise?" Emma was crying. "I promise. No matter what, I promise." By afternoon of that second day, Claire knew they wouldn't survive another night of walking. They were too dehydrated, too exhausted. They needed water or they would die. But then Noah said something. "Mom, I remember Dad talking about something on the drive. About how there were old mining camps out in the desert. Could we find one?" Claire's mind seized on that thread of hope. Mining camps. Old settlements. They'd have been built near water sources, springs or wells. If they could find one. "Noah, that's brilliant," Claire said, energy flooding back into her limbs despite her exhaustion. "Do you remember anything else? What direction he said they were?" "He pointed that way," Noah said, gesturing vaguely north. "He said they were all over this area in the 1800s. It was thin. It might lead nowhere. But it was something." "Okay," Claire decided. "When the sun gets lower, we're going to walk north. We're going to look for any signs of old camps, wood, metal, anything man-made. And if we find one, we might find water." It was a desperate plan. But desperate was all they had left. As evening approached and Claire prepared to get the kids moving again, something happened that would change everything. Emma spotted something. "Mom! There's something shiny over there." Claire looked where Emma was pointing. Maybe a quarter-mile away, something was reflecting the setting sun, a brief flash of light. "Stay here," Claire ordered. "I'm going to check what it is." She actually ran, using energy she didn't have, toward the flash. And what she found made her want to cry with relief and rage simultaneously. It was a beer can. A fresh, new beer can, one of those craft IPA brands. Which meant someone had been here recently. In this desolate place, someone had driven through recently enough to toss trash. Where there were vehicles, there were roads. Where there were roads, there was civilization. Claire looked around frantically and spotted it, faint tire tracks, almost erased by wind but still visible if you knew what to look for. A trail. Not a road, but some kind of vehicle trail. "Kids!" Claire shouted. "Come here. I found something." When they reached her, she showed them the tire tracks. "We follow these," she said with certainty. "These will lead to a road, or a camp, or something. Come on." New energy filled them all, the energy of hope. They followed the faint tracks as the sun set, and as darkness fell, Claire made a decision: they would keep walking. All night if they had to. Because they were close now. She could feel it. Around 11 p.m., Sophie collapsed. Just stopped walking and fell. Claire picked her up, but the little girl was burning with fever, clearly suffering heat stroke, her breathing shallow. "Stay with me, baby," Claire whispered, carrying her daughter. "Just stay with me a little longer. Please." Emma and Noah were barely functioning, holding each other up, stumbling forward more by will than ability. And Claire was at her absolute limit, vision blurring,
thoughts fragmenting, body screaming for water and rest.
But she kept walking.
One foot in front of the other. Because the alternative was death.
And then, around midnight, they saw it, a light. A small, flickering light in the distance.
There, Claire gasped.
There's something there. Come on.
They stumbled toward the light, and as they got closer, Claire realized what it was, an old mining camp.
Not abandoned, inhabited.
There was a small RV, a pickup truck, some camping equipment, and a campfire where two men sat drinking beer and talking. They were rockhounds, hobbyists who came out to the desert to search for minerals and gemstones, camping for weeks at a time in remote areas. The two men, Jeff and Carlos, looked up in shock as Claire stumbled into their campsite carrying Sophie, with Emma and Noah behind her.
Holy shit, Jeff said, jumping up. Are you okay? What happened? Claire tried to speak but couldn't. Her throat was too dry.
Carlos grabbed a water bottle and ran to her.
Slowly, he said. Drink slowly.
Claire took a sip, let it moisten her mouth, then finally managed to speak. My husband
abandoned us 2 days ago. Desert. Need help. Daughter sick. Both men immediately jumped into action.
Carlos got Sophie, evaluating her condition with the experience of someone who dealt with heat emergencies before.
She's got heat stroke, he said grimly. We need to cool her down now and get her to a hospital.
Jeff was already on his satellite phone. They had no cell service out here, but rockhounds who spent weeks in remote desert always had satellite communication.
I'm calling search and rescue, Jeff said. Hang on, we're getting you help.
Carlos had Sophie in the RV, using wet towels to cool her down, giving her water drop by drop.
Emma and Noah were drinking water slowly, supervised by Jeff, who knew that drinking too much too fast when severely dehydrated could be dangerous.
And Claire, finally safe, finally able to stop being strong for just a moment, collapsed. She fell to her knees and started sobbing, huge, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep. All the terror she'd been holding back, all the rage at Robert, all the desperation of the last 2 days, came flooding out.
He left us to die, she sobbed. My husband drove us out here and abandoned us.
He left his own children to die in the desert.
Jeff knelt beside her. You're safe now, he said gently. You're all safe.
And what he did, that's a crime.
The authorities will handle it.
I don't care about authorities, Claire said, her voice turning hard through the tears. I care about making sure everyone knows what he did.
Making sure he can't hurt anyone else. Making sure he pays.
He will, Carlos called from the RV, I promise you, he will.
People who do things like this always think they're going to get away with it. But you survived. You're witnesses. And that changes everything.
A helicopter arrived within an hour, search and rescue dispatched from the nearest base. The medics immediately began treating all 4 of them, with Sophie, the most critical, getting priority care. You probably saved their lives by finding us when you did, one medic told Claire as they prepared to airlift them to a hospital.
Another few hours and... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to.
As Claire was loaded into the helicopter, she looked out at the vast desert that had almost killed her family, and she made a promise to herself, to her children, to every other family that might someday face what they'd faced. Robert Sullivan would not get away with this.
Not with attempted murder. Not with abandonment.
Not with betting that his family was weak enough to die quietly. Because they'd survived.
Against all odds, against the desert, against heat and dehydration and despair, they'd survived. And now came the reckoning. Robert Sullivan was about to discover that the wife he'd abandoned was nobody's victim.
And the reaction that would surprise everyone, the reaction that would make national news and change laws and inspire countless others, was just beginning.
Because Claire Sullivan's desert survival wasn't the end of the story.
It was just the beginning. Claire and her children were taken to a hospital in Barstow, California, where they spent 3 days recovering from severe dehydration, heat stroke, and exposure. Sophie, the youngest, was the most critical. She'd been on the edge of organ failure and would need additional monitoring. But all 4 would survive.
Physically, at least. The emotional and psychological scars would take much longer to heal. While Claire was in the hospital, the police came, specifically, Detective Sarah Martinez from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, who specialized in domestic violence and attempted murder cases. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Martinez began gently, "I need to take your statement about what happened. And I want you to know, we've already issued a warrant for your husband's arrest. But I need you to tell me everything." So Claire did. She told the detective about Robert's increasing stress, about how he'd suggested that adventure day, about how he'd deliberately driven them deep into the desert, about how he'd encouraged them to walk away from the car and then had simply driven off, abandoning them. "He left us to die," Claire said flatly. "It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mental break. It was calculated. He wanted us to die in the desert so he could disappear and start over without the burden of his family." Detective Martinez took notes, her face hardening as the story unfolded. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've seen a lot of terrible things in my career. But this abandoning 3 small children and their mother in the Mojave in July, this is one of the worst. He had to know they would die. He counted on it," Claire said. "That's the point. He wanted us dead. The question is, can you find him?" "We will," Martinez promised. "And when we do, he's going to face multiple counts of attempted murder, child endangerment, and abandonment. He's looking at life in prison if convicted." "Good," Claire said, her voice hard. "Because that's exactly what he deserves." But finding Robert Sullivan proved more difficult than expected. His SUV was found 3 days later, abandoned near the Mexican border, wiped clean of fingerprints. Border surveillance showed someone matching Robert's description crossing into Mexico on foot, but without definitive proof, Mexican authorities couldn't help. Robert had planned well. He'd had time to establish a fake identity, move money to untraceable accounts, create an escape route. He'd thought he'd committed the perfect crime, a family lost in the desert, presumed dead, with him presumed dead with them. Except for one small problem, they weren't dead. They were alive, and they were talking. The story hit the news within days. "Husband abandons family in desert heat, wife and children survive against all odds," screamed the headlines. Within 48 hours, it was national news. Within a week, international. Everyone wanted to interview Claire in news programs, talk shows, podcasts, documentaries. Everyone wanted to know how she'd kept her children alive, how she'd found the strength, how she felt about her husband. And Claire, once she was recovered enough to speak publicly, did something that surprised everyone: she didn't play the victim. She didn't cry on camera or ask for sympathy. Instead, she went on offense. In her first televised interview, on a major network news program, Claire looked directly into the camera and said, "My name is Claire Sullivan, and my husband Robert Sullivan tried to murder me and our 3 children Emma, 10, Noah, 7, and Sophie, 4. He drove us deep into the Mojave Desert in 115-degree heat and abandoned us with almost no water, no food, no phone, and no way to get help. He did this deliberately because he saw his family as a burden he wanted to eliminate. But we survived. And now I'm going to spend every day making sure everyone knows what Robert Sullivan did. Making sure his face is everywhere. Making sure he can never hide, never feel safe, never escape what he's done." The interviewer, clearly not expecting such a forceful response, asked, "Claire, how do you feel about your husband now?" Claire's smile was cold. "I don't feel anything about him. He's not my husband anymore. He's a criminal who tried to murder children. And I'm going to make sure he faces justice for that." The interview went viral. Millions of views. And suddenly, Claire wasn't just a survivor, she was a symbol. A woman who refused to be a victim, who'd saved her children through sheer determination, and who was now pursuing her would-be killer with relentless focus. More surprising was the children's reaction. Emma, in an interview approved by her therapist, said on camera, "My dad left us to die because he cared more about himself than about us. But we survived because my mom is stronger than he ever was. And I want every kid out there who has a parent who hurts them to know, you can survive. You can get stronger. And the bad people don't always win."
The clip of 10-year-old Emma speaking with such clarity and strength about her father's abandonment was shared millions of times.
People were stunned by the family's response, not trauma and withdrawal, but strength and determination. But the most surprising reaction came from what Claire did next.
She started a foundation, the Desert Survivors Foundation, dedicated to two causes. First, helping other victims of domestic violence and family abandonment find resources, support, and legal help. Second, creating a national database and alert system for family annihilation attempts, cases where one family member tries to kill the others.
Robert isn't unique, Claire explained in speeches and interviews. Every year, hundreds of people, mostly men, try to kill their entire families. Sometimes they succeed.
Sometimes the families survive but are too traumatized or scared to speak out. I'm creating a space where survivors can share their stories, support each other, and help law enforcement track these criminals.
The foundation took off. Donations poured in.
Survivors of similar situations came forward to share their stories, many for the first time. And most importantly, law enforcement agencies began coordinating better, sharing information about family annihilation attempts, creating a national tracking system that helped identify patterns and prevent future incidents.
But Claire wasn't done.
She also launched something else, a crowd-funded manhunt for Robert Sullivan. Working with private investigators, bounty hunters, and international search specialists, Claire put together a team dedicated to finding her ex-husband. She'd filed for divorce the moment she was out of the hospital. She established a $100,000 reward for information leading to his capture. And she made sure Robert's face was everywhere: billboards, social media, news programs, podcasts. She wanted him to never feel safe, to always be looking over his shoulder, to know that she was coming for him.
Some people might think I'm obsessed, Claire said in one interview. They might think I should just focus on healing and move on.
But here's the thing, Robert Sullivan tried to murder 3 children.
He tried to murder me. And he thinks he got away with it. As long as he's free, he's dangerous.
As long as he's free, he might do it again to someone else, in some other place.
I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to find him.
And I'm going to make sure he spends the rest of his life in prison.
The public response was overwhelmingly supportive.
People admired Claire's strength, her refusal to be victimized, her determination to pursue justice not just for herself but for others. Within 6 months of the abandonment, Claire Sullivan had become a national figure, speaking at events, advocating for policy changes, helping other survivors, and never, ever letting people forget what Robert Sullivan had done.
Detective Martinez told reporters, "I've never seen anything like this in my career."
Usually, attempted murder victims, especially in domestic cases, struggle with trauma, fear, shame.
They often don't want to speak publicly. But Claire Sullivan? She's turned her victimization into activism. She's not hiding. She's not afraid. She's hunting. And honestly, if I were Robert Sullivan, I'd be terrified. The children, too, surprised everyone with their resilience. Yes, they were in therapy. Yes, they had nightmares and trauma. But they were also thriving in ways that defied expectations. Emma had become an advocate in her own right, speaking to other children about surviving abandonment. Noah had started writing a book about their experience, with help from a ghostwriter, to raise money for the foundation. Even Sophie, though only 4 when it happened, showed remarkable strength. When asked by a child psychologist if she missed her daddy, she'd said simply, "He's not my daddy anymore." Daddies don't leave you in the desert. He's just a bad man. The Sullivan family's reaction to their attempted murder, strength, activism, relentless pursuit of justice, was so unexpected, so contrary to the typical victim narrative, that it changed the conversation about domestic violence and family annihilation attempts. Other survivors saw Claire and her children and thought, if they can be that strong, maybe I can too. Law enforcement saw the effectiveness of public pressure and crowd-funded investigations and began incorporating similar tactics into their own work. And society began to understand that survivors don't have to be broken, quiet, or ashamed. They can be fierce, loud, and unrelenting. But the question remained, would they find Robert Sullivan? Would their determination and the massive public attention actually lead to his capture? Or had Robert succeeded in disappearing completely, leaving Claire and her children to live forever with the knowledge that their would-be killer was out there somewhere, free? The answer would come, but not in the way anyone expected. Because Robert Sullivan, it turned out, had made one crucial mistake: he'd underestimated his wife. Again. 8 months after the abandonment, on a March evening in 2025, Claire received a call from Detective Martinez. "We found him," Martinez said without preamble. "We found Robert. And you're not going to believe where he was." "Where?" Claire asked, her heart racing. "Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Living under the name Richard Stone. Working at a beach resort. Living in a decent apartment. Dating someone new. Living his best life while you and your kids were recovering from his murder attempt." Claire felt rage flood through her. "How did you find him?" "Your foundation," Martinez said. "Someone recognized him from the billboards and social media campaigns you've been running. A tourist from California was vacationing in Puerto Vallarta, saw Robert at the resort, and called our tip line. We verified it was him, coordinated with Mexican authorities, and arrested him this morning. He's being extradited back to California as we speak. He'll be here in 2 days." Claire closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her: relief, vindication, and a fierce satisfaction. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for not giving up." "Claire, you're the one who didn't give up," Martinez said. "Your campaign, your foundation, your refusal to let people forget, that's what caught him. You caught him. We just did the paperwork." When the news broke that Robert Sullivan had been captured, it became a massive story again. Desert abandonment husband arrested in Mexico led every news cycle. People who'd been following Claire's case celebrated. Survivors of similar situations felt hope. And Robert, being extradited back to face justice, became the face of why you can't get away with trying to kill your family. Robert's first court appearance was packed with media, supporters of Claire, and domestic violence advocates. He looked different: tan, thinner, with dyed hair and a beard he'd grown as disguise. But it was definitely him. When Claire entered the courtroom, she'd been granted permission to attend and to give a victim impact statement at the arraignment. Robert refused to look at her. But Claire looked at him. Stared at him with such intensity that people in the courtroom later said it was like watching a predator lock onto prey. When it was her turn to speak, Claire stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, 8 months ago, Robert Sullivan drove me and our 3 children into the Mojave Desert and abandoned us in 115-degree heat with no water, no shelter, and no way to call for help. He did this deliberately, planning for us to die so he could escape his financial problems and family responsibilities and start a new life. But we didn't die. We survived. I kept my children alive by digging shelters in sand, by rationing water, by walking through the night, by refusing to give up. And when we were rescued, barely alive, I made a promise: Robert Sullivan would not get away with what he did. For 8 months, I've worked every single day to find him. I created a foundation. I raised money. I put his face everywhere. I made sure he could never hide, never feel safe, never escape. And it worked. He's here now, facing justice, because I refused to let him disappear." She finally looked directly at Robert, who was forced to meet her eyes. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was dependent. You thought I would die quietly in the desert and you'd get away with murder. But you were wrong about me. You were always wrong about me. And now you're going to spend decades in prison thinking about how the wife you tried to kill is the reason you got caught." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Then Claire added, her voice dropping to something cold and hard, "And Robert? Every time you think about those years in prison? Remember this: your children survived. They're thriving. They're strong. And they don't think about you at all. You're nothing to them now. Just a bad dream they woke up from." She turned back to the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor." As Claire left the courtroom, media swarmed her, but she made only one statement: "Justice is coming. And it's going to be exactly what he deserves." Robert was denied bail, considered a massive flight risk given that he'd already fled to Mexico once.
His trial was set for 6 months later, and the prosecution made it clear they were seeking the maximum sentence on all counts.
Multiple counts of attempted murder. Multiple counts of child endangerment. Abandonment. Reckless endangerment.
If convicted on all counts, Robert was looking at consecutive life sentences. But Robert's lawyer tried a defense that stunned everyone. They claimed Robert had been suffering from a mental break, that he'd been suicidal and not thinking clearly, that he'd never actually intended for his family to die, he just needed to escape and had believed they'd find help. It was a weak defense, and the prosecution tore it apart. They presented evidence that Robert had been planning this for weeks, moving money, creating a fake identity, researching the desert, calculating how long it would take for exposure to kill someone in July heat. They presented evidence that Robert had been living comfortably in Mexico under his fake name, dating someone new, showing no signs of mental illness or remorse.
And they presented Claire and the children.
Emma, now 11, testified about watching her father drive away, about the terror of being abandoned, about nearly dying in the desert. Noah, now 8, testified about how his little sister almost died, about how his mom had saved them all. And Sophie, now 5, testified in a closed hearing due to her age about how she didn't have a daddy anymore, just a bad man who'd hurt her family. But the most powerful testimony came from Claire herself. For 2 full days, she told the court everything: the financial problems Robert had hidden, the moment he'd abandoned them, the desperate survival, the lasting trauma. And she presented evidence that she'd gathered: Robert's internet search history from weeks before the abandonment, showing searches like "how long to die from dehydration" and "Mojave Desert most remote areas" and "bodies never found in desert." He researched how to kill us, Claire told the jury. He planned where to leave us so we'd die and our bodies would never be found. He wanted us to simply disappear so he could start over.
This wasn't a mental break. This wasn't temporary insanity.
This was calculated, premeditated attempted murder of his entire family. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours.
Guilty on all counts. Every single charge.
At sentencing, the judge looked at Robert with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Sullivan, you committed one of the most heinous crimes I've encountered in my 20 years on the bench. You attempted to murder 3 innocent children and their mother, your own family, for your own convenience. You showed no remorse, no conscience, no humanity."
Mrs. Sullivan's victim impact statement described how you underestimated her, thought she was weak.
You were catastrophically wrong.
She not only saved herself and your children, but she hunted you down across international borders. She turned her victimization into activism that has helped countless others.
She showed more strength in 2 days in the desert than you've shown in your entire life. I'm sentencing you to 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for the attempted murders.
You will spend the rest of your life in prison. You will never be free. You will never escape what you've done. And every day, you'll have to live with the knowledge that you failed to kill your family, you failed to escape justice, and you failed to break the woman you tried to murder. Robert was led away in chains. He didn't look at Claire or his children. He kept his head down, defeated. Claire, surrounded by her children, watched him go with no emotion on her face. No triumph, no anger, no sadness. Just calm certainty that justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, Claire made a final statement to the media: Robert Sullivan will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's not revenge, that's justice. And it's justice not just for me and my children, but for every family who's ever faced this kind of violence, this kind of abandonment, this kind of betrayal. The Desert Survivors Foundation will continue its work helping other families. We'll continue advocating for better laws, better protection, better support for survivors. And we'll continue making sure that people who try to commit family annihilation know you won't get away with it. Survivors are stronger than you think. And we will hunt you down. The reporter asked, "Claire, how do you feel now that it's over?" Claire looked at her 3 children standing beside her: Emma, Noah, and Sophie, all alive, all healing, all strong in ways Robert had never been. "It's not over," Claire said. "Our healing isn't over. Our work isn't over. But this chapter, the chapter about Robert Sullivan, that's closed. He doesn't matter anymore. He's just a convict. Our lives are about so much more than what he did to us." We're survivors, advocates, and a family. That's what matters. And with that, Claire Sullivan, the woman Robert had abandoned in the desert to die, walked away from the courthouse with her children, ready to continue the life she'd fought so hard to preserve. But the story didn't end there. Because the reaction that had surprised everyone, the strength, the activism, the relentless pursuit of justice, was about to inspire something even bigger. Something that would change lives across the country and around the world. The Desert Survivors Foundation was just getting started. In the 3 years following Robert Sullivan's conviction, something remarkable happened. Claire's story became a catalyst for change far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The Desert Survivors Foundation grew from a small operation into a nationally recognized organization with chapters in 15 states and international partnerships. But more than that, Claire and her children Emma, Noah, and Sophie became symbols of something powerful: the refusal to be defined by trauma. Emma, now 13, had become an advocate for children of attempted family annihilation. She spoke at schools, wrote articles for teen magazines, and had published a book, with extensive help from professional writers, called Survive and Thrive: A Kid's Guide to Life After Trauma. The book became a bestseller, with all proceeds going to the foundation. People always ask me if I'm angry at my dad, Emma said in interviews. And honestly, I'm not. I'm disappointed. I'm sad for the person he could have been. But I'm not angry, because anger would mean I'm still letting him affect my life. He's in prison. I'm free. I'm thriving. That's the best revenge, living well. Noah, now 11, had taken a different path. He'd become fascinated with emergency preparedness and survival training. He'd taken courses, earned certifications, and was working toward becoming a wilderness survival instructor when he was old enough. What happened to us doesn't have to happen to others, Noah explained. If people know how to survive in extreme conditions, if they're prepared, they have better chances. I want to teach people those skills. Sophie, now 7, was the youngest and still processing everything with the help of therapists. But even she showed remarkable resilience. When asked by a child psychologist how she felt about what had happened, Sophie said simply, "My old daddy tried to hurt us. But my mom saved us. And now I have a new daddy." She was referring to Claire's boyfriend, a paramedic named James who'd entered their lives 2 years after the trial and had proven himself worthy of Sophie's trust. My new daddy doesn't leave people. He saves them. That's better. But it was Claire's work that had the most far-reaching impact. The Desert Survivors Foundation had accomplished remarkable things. 1. They'd lobbied successfully for Claire's law in California, legislation that required better tracking of family annihilation attempts, created harsher penalties for abandonment of minors, and established a state database of domestic violence offenders who'd shown interest in killing their entire families. 2. They'd created a national hotline and support network for survivors of family violence, staffed 24/7 by trained counselors and survivor advocates. The hotline received over 10,000 calls in its first year alone. 3. They'd partnered with law enforcement agencies across the country to train officers in recognizing warning signs of family annihilation attempts, financial stress combined with searching for life insurance information, research into remote locations, sudden changes in behavior. They'd established a scholarship fund for children who'd survived family violence, helping them afford college and escape the cycle of trauma. 5. Most significantly, they'd created what they called the Survivor Network, an online platform where survivors of family abandonment and violence could connect, share stories, support each other, and coordinate efforts to find perpetrators who'd fled justice. The network had helped locate 7 fugitives in 3 years. But beyond the organizational accomplishments, it was Claire's personal transformation that truly inspired people. She'd gone from being a stay-at-home mom who'd never imagined she'd have to fight for survival to becoming a nationally recognized advocate, author. She'd written her own memoir, Left to Die: How My Children and I Survived the Desert and Hunted Down the Man Who Abandoned Us, and speaker who commanded 5-figure fees for appearances. More importantly, she'd found healing not by forgetting what happened, but by transforming it into purpose. People ask me all the time how I'm not bitter, Claire said in a TED Talk 3 years after the abandonment that went viral with over 20 million views. How I'm not angry, how I'm not broken. And here's the truth: I am angry. I am bitter sometimes. I do have moments where the trauma feels overwhelming. But I refuse to let those moments define me. I refused to give Robert Sullivan that power. He tried to take everything from me, my life, my children's lives, my future. But he failed. And now I'm using what he did to help others, to create change, to make sure fewer families face what we faced. That's not forgetting. That's not even forgiving. I'll never forgive what he did. But it's transforming. It's taking the worst thing that ever happened to me and making it matter. Making it mean something beyond just survival. Making it count. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. The talk was shared millions of times and became required watching in domestic violence courses across the country. Meanwhile, Robert Sullivan was in prison, specifically, California State Prison, Corcoran, serving his 4 consecutive life sentences. Reports from inside said he was not adjusting well. He'd been attacked twice by other inmates who'd seen his case on the news and didn't take kindly to child abusers. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated, with minimal contact with other prisoners. He'd filed appeals, of course, claiming his trial had been unfair, that the media attention had biased the jury, that his lawyer had been incompetent. Every appeal had been denied. His life was exactly what the judge had promised, a cage until he died. Claire had been asked multiple times if she'd ever visit Robert in prison, if she'd ever want to confront him face to face again. Her answer was always the same: why would I? He doesn't matter. He's nothing. He's just a man in a cage who made terrible choices and is paying for them. I have no interest in seeing him, speaking to him, or giving him any of my time or energy. He's irrelevant. This attitude, treating Robert not as a monster or villain, but as simply irrelevant, beneath notice, was perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Sullivan family's reaction to their attempted murder. They hadn't let it consume them. They'd survived, healed, thrived, and then simply moved on, using their experience to help others but not dwelling on the man who tried to kill them. Psychologists studied the Sullivan family, trying to understand their unusual resilience. Dr. Patricia Torres, a trauma specialist who'd worked with the family, explained in a research paper, the Sullivan family's response to their trauma demonstrates what we call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people who experience severe trauma don't just recover, but actually become stronger, more resilient, and find new purpose and meaning in their lives. What makes the Sullivans unusual is the speed and completeness of their transformation. Typically, post-traumatic growth takes many years and doesn't occur in every trauma survivor. But Claire Sullivan made a conscious, immediate decision: she would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. More than that, she would be a warrior for other survivors. 5 years after the abandonment, Claire Sullivan received a letter. It was from Robert, forwarded through the prison system and her lawyer. She'd made it clear she wanted no direct contact. Her first instinct was to throw it away unread. But something made her pause. Maybe curiosity. Maybe a need for closure. Maybe just wanting to see if Robert had learned anything in 5 years of imprisonment. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Robert's cramped script. It read, "Claire, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to respond. I don't even expect you to believe anything I say. But I need to write it anyway, even if it's just screaming into the void. I'm sorry. I know those words mean nothing. I know they can't undo what I did. But they're true. I am sorry, not because I got caught, not because I'm in prison, but because I finally understand what I did. For the first 5 years I was in here, I was still making excuses. Still telling myself I'd been desperate, that I'd had a mental break, that circumstances had pushed me to it. Still believing, on some level, that I was the victim of debt, victim of pressure, victim of a society that didn't give me better options. But that was bullshit. All of it. And I finally see that now. I wasn't a victim. I was a coward. I had a family that loved me, and instead of asking for help, instead of admitting I was drowning, instead of being honest about our financial situation and working together to fix it, I decided the easiest solution was to make all of you disappear. To literally murder you and our children rather than face my problems like a man. And the worst part? I underestimated you. I thought you were weak, dependent, incapable. I thought you'd die in that desert within 24 hours. I didn't know you were a trained nurse. I didn't know you'd have the survival skills. I didn't know you had that kind of strength in you. But I should have known. Because you showed me that strength every day of our marriage, raising 3 kids, managing a household, dealing with my stress and moods, holding everything together while I focused on my career. You were always strong. I just never noticed because I never really saw you. I saw a wife, a mother, a support system for my life. But I never saw you, the actual person, with your own strength and intelligence and capability. And our kids. God, our kids. I tried to murder 3 innocent children because they were inconvenient. Because their needs were too much. Because I couldn't handle being a father. Emma, who's brilliant and strong and would have been an incredible adult. Noah, who's creative and kind and deserved better than a father who saw him as a burden. Sophie, who was 4 years old and whose only crime was existing. I destroyed my own family. And for what? A few months of freedom in Mexico before you found me? The chance to start over without responsibilities? It was the worst trade in history. I gave up everything that actually mattered for a fantasy that wasn't even real. I've had 5 years to think about this. 5 years of sitting in a cell, watching your interviews on TV when other inmates talk about the news, hearing about your foundation and your success and how you've turned what I did into something meaningful. And you want to know what I feel? I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to feel that. I know my pride means nothing. But I'm proud. You took the worst thing I ever did and you made it matter. You saved lives with it. You created change with it. You showed the world that survivors don't have to be broken. And I'm grateful that you survived. Grateful that our kids survived. Not because it means I'm not a murderer, I just failed at it, but because they get to live. They get to grow up. They get to have futures I tried to steal from them. I know you'll never forgive me. I know I'll die in this prison, alone, having lost everything. And I know I deserve exactly that. This isn't a plea for sympathy or forgiveness. This is just an acknowledgement of what I did. Of what I destroyed. Of what you built from the ashes. You asked me once, in your victim impact statement, what kind of man abandons his family in the desert? I'll tell you, the worst kind. A coward. A failure. A man who chose the easy way over the right way and destroyed everything in the process. I hope Emma, Noah, and Sophie never think about me. I hope they barely remember me. I hope they have a good father figure in their lives now, someone who actually deserves them. And I hope you found happiness, Claire. Real happiness. The kind I was too broken to give you. I'm sorry. For everything. For all of it. For being the worst version of what a husband and father should be. Robert. Claire read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down and sat quietly for a long time, processing her feelings. There was no dramatic emotional release. No tears, no rage, no sudden forgiveness. Just a quiet acknowledgement that Robert had finally understood what he'd done. It didn't change anything. He was still in prison. He still deserved to be there. But it was something, a small piece of closure she hadn't known she needed. She wrote back. 1 page, Robert, I received your letter. I believe you're sorry. I believe you finally understand what you did. But it doesn't change anything. You tried to murder our children. You tried to murder me. And you'll spend the rest of your life in prison for that. As you should. I don't forgive you. I never will. But I do accept your apology for what it is, too little, too late, but at least genuine. The kids are thriving. They don't think about you. They have a good life with people who love them and would never abandon them. That's all you need to know. Don't write again. I won't read it. This is closure. This is the end. Claire. She sent the letter and then did something symbolic. She took Robert's letter and the copy of her response, sealed them in a box along with other mementos from the abandonment and trial, news clippings, court documents,
photos from the desert survival, and stored the box in her attic.
Closed. Finished. Done.
That night, she told Emma, Noah, and Sophie about the letter at dinner.
Your father wrote to me, she said. He apologized. I think he meant it. But it doesn't change anything.
He's still the man who tried to kill us, and he's still in prison where he belongs.
Emma, now 15, shrugged. Did you write back? Yes. I told him we're doing well and that he shouldn't contact us again. Good, Emma said. Because honestly, I don't care if he's sorry or not. It doesn't affect my life either way. Noah, now 13, asked, Do you think he's really changed? Maybe, Claire said. People can change. But change doesn't erase what you did. He can be a different person now and still deserve to be in prison for the rest of his life. Both things can be true. Sophie, now 9, had the final word. Can we have dessert now? I don't want to talk about the bad man anymore.
And that, really, was the Sullivan family's ultimate reaction to Robert's abandonment attempt: indifference. He'd tried to destroy them, and they'd not only survived but thrived. And now he was just irrelevant.
A closed chapter. A problem solved. Someone who didn't merit their time or emotional energy anymore.
And her children, following her example and receiving excellent therapeutic support, have done the same.
They've taken their trauma and transformed it into strength, advocacy, and purpose. It's remarkable. For years after the abandonment, on the anniversary of the day Robert had left them in the desert, the Sullivan family started a tradition. They would return to the Mojave Desert, not to the spot where they'd been abandoned, but to a beautiful overlook where they could see the vastness of the desert they'd survived. They'd bring a picnic, spend the day together, and talk about how far they'd come. On the 4th anniversary, as they sat together watching the sunset over the desert, Emma said something that captured everything they'd become. You know what's funny?
Dad thought the desert would kill us. But instead, it showed us how strong we were.
It showed Mom she was basically a superhero. It showed me I could survive anything. It showed Noah he could help save Sophie. And it showed Sophie that even when bad things happen, good people show up. Dad gave us the worst day of our lives. But we turned it into the thing that made us who we are. So really, we should probably thank him. Absolutely not, Claire said immediately, and everyone laughed.
He's still a terrible person who tried to murder us.
True, Emma agreed.
But we're still here. We're still together.
We're still thriving. And he's not. So we won.
Sophie, now 7 and wise beyond her years, added, We didn't just win.
We won super big. Because we have each other and he has nobody. Noah raised his water bottle.
A toast to surviving, to thriving, and to being stronger than anything that tries to break us. They all raised their bottles and drank, sitting together on a desert overlook, a family that had been forged in the worst circumstances imaginable and had come out stronger, closer, and more purposeful than most families ever become. The sun set over the Mojave, the same desert that had nearly claimed them, now just a backdrop to their triumph. And somewhere, in a prison cell hundreds of miles away, Robert Sullivan sat alone, having lost everything that mattered because he'd never understood what mattered at all. 10 years after the abandonment, Claire Sullivan sat in her office at the Desert Survivors Foundation headquarters, a beautiful facility in Riverside, California, that housed counseling services, legal aid, support groups, and administrative offices for what had become a multi-million-dollar organization serving thousands of survivors annually. She was 45 now, older than she'd ever imagined she'd live to be during those desperate days in the desert. But she was also stronger, more purposeful, and more at peace than she'd ever been in her first 35 years. The kids, she still thought of them as kids even though Emma was now 20 and in college, were all thriving in ways that continued to amaze her. Emma was at Stanford, studying psychology and criminal justice, planning to become a prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases. She'd written a second book about healing from family trauma that had been even more successful than the first. She gave speeches, did podcast interviews, and had become a voice for young survivors of family violence. I'm going to do what Mom did, Emma had told Claire. I'm going to take the worst thing that happened to me and make it count.
I'm going to put people like Dad in prison and make sure they never hurt anyone again. Noah was 17, a senior in high school, and had indeed pursued his passion for survival and emergency preparedness. He'd completed wilderness survival courses, earned his EMT certification early, and was planning to become a search and rescue specialist. He volunteered with the same search and rescue unit that had helped save his family a decade ago. I want to be the person who finds families like we were, Noah explained. I want to be the one who shows up when someone's given up hope. Because I remember what it felt like when those rockhounds found us, like we'd been given back our lives. I want to give that to other people. Sophie was 14, a high school freshman, and while she had the least conscious memory of the abandonment, she'd been only 4, it had still shaped her in profound ways. She was studying trauma psychology and wanted to work with children who'd experienced family violence. I barely remember the desert, Sophie said. But I remember feeling safe with Mom even when things were really bad. And I want other kids to feel that way, safe even in the worst situations. So I'm going to learn how to help them feel that. Claire had remarried to James, the paramedic she'd met 3 years after the abandonment. He'd been patient, understanding, and had never tried to replace the kid's father but had instead simply been present, reliable, and loving. The kids called him James rather than Dad, but the relationship was strong and genuine. You saved yourself, James had told Claire when they discussed marriage. You saved your kids. I'm not here to rescue you or fix you. I'm just here to be part of this incredible life you've built. It was exactly what Claire needed, partnership, not rescue. The Desert Survivors Foundation had expanded beyond anything Claire had imagined. They now operated in 30 states, had international partnerships, and had helped over 10,000 families directly with another 50,000 accessing their resources online. The foundation had been instrumental in passing Claire's laws in 7 states, legislation that improved tracking of family annihilation attempts, increased penalties, and provided better resources for families at risk. They'd also created an innovative program called Safe Exit, a service that helped people in overwhelming family situations, usually caretakers or breadwinners who felt trapped by responsibilities, find help, counseling, and resources before they reached the breaking point where they might harm their families. We want to catch the Robert Sullivans before they abandon their families, Claire explained in presentations about the program. We want to intervene when someone's drowning in debt and stress and feeling trapped, and show them there are options that don't involve violence or abandonment. The program had been controversial. Some critics argued it was coddling potential family killers, but the results spoke for themselves. Over 300 families had been helped through Safe Exit, and follow-up studies showed that intervention had prevented potential harm in an estimated 85% of cases. On the 10-year anniversary of the abandonment, Claire organized something special, a conference called Survive and Thrive, a decade of healing that brought together survivors of family violence, domestic abuse, and abandonment from across the country. Over 500 people attended, survivors, advocates, law enforcement, therapists, and policymakers. Emma, Noah, and Sophie all spoke at the conference, each sharing their perspective on surviving and healing. Emma's speech, titled From Victim to Prosecutor, talked about transforming trauma into purpose and how she planned to use her law degree to protect families. Noah's presentation, The Practical Side of Survival, was a workshop on actual survival skills that might save lives in emergency situations, wilderness survival, disaster preparedness, recognizing danger signs. Sophie's talk, A Child's Perspective on Family Violence, was perhaps the most powerful. She spoke about how even young children understand more than adults realize, and how healing requires acknowledging their experience rather than trying to protect them from the truth. But the keynote speech was Claire's. She stood on stage, looking out at 500 faces, survivors who'd found strength, families who'd been saved, advocates who'd been inspired by her story, and began, 10 years ago, my husband drove me and my 3 children into the Mojave Desert and abandoned us in 115-degree heat with no water, no shelter, and no way to call for help. He did this deliberately, planning for us to die so he could start a new life without the burden of his family. We were supposed to die. By every logical measure, we should have died. 3 small children and their mother, in one of the harshest environments on Earth, with no survival equipment and no help coming. But we didn't die. We survived. And not just survived, we thrived. We turned our trauma into purpose. We created change. We helped thousands of other families. We showed the world that survivors don't have to be broken. And today, 10 years later, I want to talk about something important: what it really means to survive family violence and abandonment. Claire paused, looking out at the audience. Here's what it doesn't mean: it doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It doesn't mean forgiving the person who hurt you. It doesn't mean pretending you're not affected by the trauma. Here's what it does mean: it means refusing to let what happened define you. It means choosing to build a life worth living despite what you've been through. It means using your experience to help others, to create change, to make meaning from suffering. It means understanding that the person who hurt you, whether it's a spouse who abandoned you, a parent who abused you, a family member who betrayed you, that person doesn't get to write the ending of your story. You do. Robert Sullivan tried to write the ending of our story. The ending he wanted was, family dies in desert, he escapes to Mexico, lives happily ever after. But that's not what happened. We survived. We hunted him down. We put him in prison. And then we built an entire movement dedicated to helping other survivors do the same. That's our ending. That's the ending we wrote. And it's so much better than the one he planned. The audience erupted in applause. Claire waited for it to quiet, then continued, I want every survivor in this room to understand something: you are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by what you do next. You are defined by the choices you make, the strength you show, the lives you touch, the change you create. Robert Sullivan is in prison. He'll die there. His life is over. But mine? Mine is just getting started. My kids' lives are just getting started. The thousands of families we've helped, their lives are just getting started. That's the power of survival. That's the power of refusing to be a victim. That's the power of turning your trauma into your triumph. So to every survivor here, don't let the person who hurt you win by staying broken. Don't give them that power. Take your power back. Write your own ending. And make it so incredible that the trauma becomes just a chapter, a hard chapter, a painful chapter, but just a chapter in a much larger story of strength, purpose, and triumph. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. And when it finally quieted and people began to disperse, Claire was swarmed by survivors wanting to thank her, to share their stories, to tell her how her example had helped them find their own strength. That evening, Claire and her family, Emma, Noah, Sophie, and James, drove out to the desert one more time. To their spot, the overlook where they watched sunsets every anniversary. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in golds and reds and purples. Finally, Emma said, Mom, I've been thinking about something. About forgiveness. What about it? Claire asked. I don't think I'll ever forgive what Dad did. But I think I've forgiven him. Does that make sense? Claire considered. Explain. What he did, abandoning us, trying to kill us, that's unforgivable. It always will be. But him, the person? I think I've forgiven him. Not because he deserves it, but because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him. So I let it go. I forgave him for being weak and broken and making terrible choices. But I'll never forgive the choices themselves. That's very wise, Claire said. And very mature. Noah added, I don't think I've forgiven him. But I also don't think about him much anymore. He's just irrelevant. Like a character in a movie I watched once and barely remember. Sophie, the youngest, said, I don't forgive him and I don't not forgive him because I barely remember him. He's just the bad thing that happened before all the good things. Like how you have to get through winter to get to spring. James, who'd been quiet, finally spoke, I've never met Robert. Probably never will. But I want to say something, I'm grateful he failed. Grateful you survived. Because if you hadn't, I would never have met this incredible family. The world would be missing Claire Sullivan and everything she's created. Missing Emma and Noah and Sophie and everything they're going to do. That failure, his failure, gave the world something precious. Claire reached over and squeezed James's hand. We're grateful too. For surviving. For finding each other. For building this life. They sat in silence again, watching the desert, that harsh, unforgiving landscape that had nearly killed them and had instead forged them into something stronger. Somewhere, in a prison hundreds of miles away, Robert Sullivan was in his cell. He was 48 now, having spent his entire 40s in prison. He had decades more to go before he'd die, probably in that same cell. He'd written to Claire several times over the years, despite her request that he not. She never responded. Just filed the letters away unread. She'd given him closure once. She wouldn't give it again. His therapist in prison said he was a model inmate, participated in programs, helped other prisoners, showed genuine remorse. But it didn't matter. Nothing he did in prison would undo what he'd done outside it. His life was effectively over. But Claire's life? Her children's lives? Those were just beginning. Full of purpose, full of meaning, full of the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable. As the sun finally set and darkness began to fall over the desert, Claire stood up. "Come on," she said to her family. "Let's go home." They walked back to the car together, for survivors and the man who'd proven worthy of them, leaving the desert behind once again. And the desert, silent and vast and eternal, held no answers and made no judgments. It simply existed, as it always had, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its harsh surface. But if deserts could speak, this one might have said, "Some people break when faced with my emptiness and heat." But some people? Some people become diamonds. Compressed by pressure and heat into something unbreakable, valuable, brilliant. Claire Sullivan and her children were diamonds. And the man who tried to leave them to die in my emptiness? He was just sand. Common, forgettable, already blown away by the wind. 10 years after abandonment. A family not just survived, but thriving. A foundation helping thousands. Laws changed. Lives saved. And a story that would be told for generations, about the husband who abandoned his wife and kids in the desert heat, and about their reaction, the one that surprised everyone. Not helplessness. Not death. Not even simple survival. But transformation. Triumph. And a relentless, magnificent refusal to let evil win.